No, no, no.
And you can actually find Gloria on the last page of our membership directory with just a few other people who have moved away but want to keep in touch. And we're very happy about that. So I met Gloria when she joined CHJ. I think it was in the 80s, but she would know better than I.
Okay.
And we've been friends, though distant friends, ever since. Gloria has, her contributions to CHJ have been legendary. She was president. She was chairman of committees, I think membership, programming. She wrote high holiday services and officiated at them. She initiated other services that we never had before and still use. And she's always been kind of a font of information for us and a kind of informal archivist, knowing what went on. She tried to write a history of the group, but that kind of couldn't materialize. Her personal and professional life has been remarkable. She left college to marry and raise 4 children, then returned to finish her degree and went on to earn a PhD and became a professor and dean at Iona College. Her specialty then was women's studies, but her research has ranged widely. We're going to hear a kind of exotic topic, I think, tonight. And since moving to Laguna Woods, she's maintained a schedule of writing, research, community action, cultural activities, extensive travel, all of which would phase somebody half her age. So actually, if Gloria weren't even speaking, it would be a delight to just do what we've been doing, just conversing with her. We ought to have more of those things on Zoom. Go ahead, Gloria.
Well, thanks, Marilyn. But one thing is, I should mention that it was Marilyn and Sam who brought us into the congregation. We attended a Friday evening program one time at Greenfield's house. Oh my God, at the Greenfield's house. And then we became friendly with the Brownsteins, and they kind of tugged us in. So I think that was 1980, and we stayed in the congregation until we moved in 2012. So that was a good run. And as I was saying, when we first got on and first the people got on, I've sort of recreated in a different variety. Well, maybe it's appropriate because here I'll be talking about Shakespeare and his many varieties and how people use Shakespeare. I've recreated aspects of CHJ here in this community. That's what's made it so wonderful to live here, as it was when we lived in Westport, and I just love the congregation so much. So it's good to see all of you, and good to meet some of you who are lucky enough to be in CHJ. So one of the things that it was really funny that Debbie had visited here and knows some of the people. One of the things I did, one of the many activities here is there's a Shakespeare club that meets once a month. And Cece Sloan, who had founded that club and ran it for many years until she passed away a year and a half ago, used to really flounder for programming. So when she'd get you her hooks on you were done. So I did several series on her women in literature and the Shakespeare. I did women and the 20th Amendment. She was a remarkable woman. And so several years ago, I did a series of lectures on Shakespeare in America. And one of them had to do with the Yiddish Theater and Shakespeare. And when I saw Marilyn last year when I was visiting my daughter, who lives now in my old neighborhood, I told her, that if you're still floundering for Friday night programs, this would be a good one, and I'd be glad to do it. And of course, my secret agenda was that I would get to see you all, so that was nice. So let's begin, and because it's a long lecture, and I don't have any PowerPoints and photos. It's just going to be me. So if you think you're going to fall asleep, just shut down. So the point I want to make, and as Marilyn said, I have my PhD in, and really I was interested in 19th century America and social and cultural history. And as much as I thought I knew nothing about the importance of Shakespeare in the 19th century in America, especially in the antebellum period. It just knocked me over. And I will say, Debbie, that whatever CC kind of forced me into, I really loved. I loved digging into this, and it was really a whole fascinating read, and with lots of interesting offshoots. So the point I want to make, beside the fact that Shakespeare was just everywhere and more than you might imagine, he was sort of the only game in town. He was the social media of the day. I mean, today there's all kinds of social media. I mean, there is no one that is so prominent, but then it was Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, his plays were such that the ones that were chosen and how they were adapted reflected the issues of the day, and they defined those issues, and they shaped attitudes much as our social media do today. One of the books that I relied on was James Shapiro's 2014 book on Shakespeare in America. And to quote him, he said that Shakespeare's plays spoke to the universal issues that Americans, especially in the pre-Civil War period, confronted. Issues like, and this is a quote, issues like immigration and race that couldn't be dealt with directly could be confronted through Shakespeare. There wasn't another writer whose fiction allowed audiences to work through issues and divisions as he did. So he became a barometer of social and cultural history of change, but also in some ways, the Shakespeare defined issues in such a way that led to public policy. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of different strands, and I will eventually get to the Yiddish Theater, but I want to create this framework first. So I'm going to talk about the American theater and its developments, especially in the 19th century. And then just American society in that period, and the purpose that Shakespeare served. And then the development of the Yiddish theater from its origins in Romania to its flourishing in New York City from 1880 to 1920, the golden age of Yiddish theater, and its importance in assimilating Jews and helping them become Americans. What my grandmother used to say, Yankees. If you were a Yankee to her was the American. So to get started, the pre-Civil War, the antebellum period, was a time of enormous change. We don't study much. I don't know. I doubt if the kids with their schedules today study more than we did about that period before the Civil War, except as of events that led up to the Civil War. But it was an amazing period in American social and cultural history. In the 1830s, America was an agrarian society, and it is said to have moved from the country to the city in this period. On the eve of the Revolution, which is, a little earlier, 90% of Americans lived on farms or small towns and villages. That's 9 in 10. But by the Civil War, the equivalent of 2 generations, only 1 in 4 remained. So they left behind the security, the knowledge of agrarian life, and they were suddenly urbanized and thrown into that kind of chaos. And families were being torn apart because young people, young men and young women, were no longer needed on the farm in the same way, and were no longer needed in the cobbler shop to hand make shoes or to hand make candles or to weave and so on. So they were moving into factories, and there was a lot of conflict between parents and children, between children and the culture of the urban, the cities versus the culture of the farm. At the same time as there was this tremendous transition from the farm to the city, there was a huge immigration into the United States. 5 million immigrants from Germany and Ireland came before the Civil War, and they were quite different, although the same color as the Anglo-Saxons who were already here. They suddenly, so it was like 25% addition to the current population. So in 1820, Manhattan was a small, homogeneous city of about 125,000 people, 5,000 immigrants tops, about 5%. But by 1850, the population had quadrupled, with half being refugees from the German Revolution and starvation in Ireland. So they were very unstable. The religious verities were under attack. The Puritan Calvinist church was generations old. It lost its influence. New churches and new forms of worship emerged. That's when you had these evangelical movements and the tent meetings. Do you know that 20,000 people might attend one of those evangelical tent meetings at a time? It helps sometimes to know these things when I think that this world is just going off the deep end, to think that this isn't the first time and that we managed to get back. Then there were this amazing technology, mostly related to industrialization. So the railroad technology changed transportation, moved people around, the telegraph, communication, factories, the printing press. They started to have these quasi newspapers were more available. So transformed experience in so many different ways. So in every aspect of social and cultural life, things were turning around. And it's kind of interesting because Rip Van Winkle fell asleep in 1820. And when he woke up 20 years later to a totally incomprehensible world, those people would have gotten it. They would have understood. So some turned more urgently, some of those 20,000 to the Bible, but others turned to, of all things, to Shakespeare and the emerging American theater. So now a little bit about the theater. Again, the theater was more important than you think. It was the only game in town. And if I remind you about some of these things, you'll go, oh yeah, right. So it started in the mid-1700s when a troupe of actors arrived in Williamsburg from the London stage. Their repertoire was strictly Shakespeare, Hamlet, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Merchant of Venice, Macbeth. Those are the 5 that you hear of again and again in the United States. But they didn't last long. The religious authorities from Virginia and New England shut them out. Play acting was sinful, like gambling was, or dancing, horrors. And so they closed them down. But at the same time, the Continental Congress didn't want any kind of import from England, from the Britain. So they wouldn't let English troops enter the country either. But I mean, you can't hold theater down. Theater was irrepressible. And after the revolution, theaters became a mass phenomenon. And the theaters themselves were built in every town. They had these little opera houses and theaters. They didn't have much. It was half of a block, but it would have a theater. And they were main gathering places in towns and cities. But within a few years, New York, Boston, Philadelphia had dozens of theaters. And inventions, again, in construction, which allowed them to build larger buildings and taller, and gas lighting, so you could have things going on in the evening, meant that these theaters were able to accommodate larger audiences than I had expected, up to 3,500 a night in Philadelphia or in Boston. It was really important. Then we had traveling theater companies that went everywhere in the hinterland. They stopped in rural villages and small towns. Remember Huckleberry Finn? Who did Huck and Jim meet on the travails down the river? It was that traveling troupe of Shakespearean actors, and that was commonplace. We didn't think twice about it when we read it, but that's what it was. And everybody went. It wasn't just for the elite merchants in town. It was everybody in town went. And the prices were different at different levels. And even prostitutes sat in a certain section with freed slaves, free blacks. But there were tiers, and everybody turned up for a Shakespeare play. Although there were other plays, there were melodramas and operettas, minstrel shows. The adaptations of the Shakespeare plays were the staple of the American theater. But Shakespeare was everywhere in American culture in that period, not just in theaters. I mean, the things that Shakespeare addressed, like James Shapiro said, that couldn't be talked of otherwise: political intrigue, betrayal, power struggles, family entanglement, corruption. These were all concerns that 19th centuries experienced. And those plays, had them. The conflict between children who wouldn't listen, Romeo and Juliet running off, doing their own thing. So where else were they? In every home had a copy of the Bible and a Shakespeare. In 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville, some of you maybe remember that name. I bet, Rona, you do. Yeah. Was sent by the French government to take the temperature of this American people. Who were they? What were they like? And he wrote this fabulous book that I still enjoy. But in it, he wrote to the French government, "There is hardly a pioneer hut that does not contain a few odd volumes of Shakespeare. I read the feudal drama of Henry V for the first time in the log cabin." But schoolhouses featured Shakespeare also, whether it's in the city or these one-room schoolhouses. They had to memorize Shakespeare speeches for elocution and for rhetoric. And their texts were these McGuffey readers and Scott's lessons in elocution. The readers sold, this is incredible, over 120 million copies between the 1830s and 1900. And they were a major influence on American identity and values. And so not only with all these McGuffey readers around, but there would be one in a family, let's say, and 6 children, so that their effect was multiplied. And they had Shakespeare's plays in them that had to be memorized. Later, I might mention that Lincoln had to memorize these, and he read these by firelight in the log cabin. And they said that when he was sitting for his portrait, to make the time go, he would just start at the beginning and start reciting all the passages that he remembered. But in the public sphere also, in addition to just being in a formal theater, Shakespeare was everywhere. There were reports that when soldiers were bivouacked and had nothing to do, they would enact parts of Shakespeare. I mean, some of them had memorized these, or they would just contemporaneously, they knew the story and they'd make the rest up. It's kind of interesting. General James Longstreet, who was supposed to be like 6'2", 6'3", was supposed to play the frail Desdemona in Othello, and they said, no, he's too tall. So they selected Ulysses Grant. So Ulysses Grant was going to play Desdemona when the troops were bivouacked in Texas before the Mexican-American War. Miners were reported in the San Francisco newspaper sat around the Gold Rush campfires, also acting out Shakespeare's plays. And the papers reported that they, and this is a quote, they swarmed from the gambling saloons and cheap fandango houses to see Hamlet and Lear in San Francisco. Even violent immigrant gangs of New York, the gangs of New York loved Shakespeare. They frequented the Bowery Theater, which was their theater, and the famous Shakespearean actor Edwin Forrest was their favorite, and he made his debut at that theater. That was their hangout. And one of the leaders of Tammany Hall, one of the lieutenants of Tammany Hall, masterminded in 1849 this huge riot at the fancy uptown Astor Opera House at a performance of Macbeth. by Forrest's rival, the British actor William McReady. Forrest had this interpretation of Macbeth that was very tough. He kicked things over, didn't care about anybody, read his lines in that way. And McReady was supposedly a very effete interpretation of Shakespeare. But it was not only resentment toward the upper crust, but also it was Tammany Hall who would engineer this because they wanted to embarrass the Whigs and consolidate their power. Up to 25,000 immigrants and other working men participated in that movie, and dozens were killed. That lasted for 3 days, all because they tried to stop McReady's performance of Macbeth. So we would also expect that the well-educated elite of American society would be familiar with Shakespeare, as they were. And not only familiar with him, but they often relied on Shakespeare for social and political and even personal advice. A lot of them, it was a habit to carry a small copy of Shakespeare in their pockets around with them and refer to them like very religious people might open up the Bible. George Washington was a lifelong enthusiast, and so was Thomas Jefferson, and both of them haunted the playhouses of Williamsburg, Virginia. And this is cute. In 1786, Jefferson and Adams were in England, John Adams, and they went on a pilgrimage to Shakespeare's home in Stratford-on-Avon, and they cut a sliver of wood off of Shakespeare's writing chair. Jefferson kept that souvenir in Monticello, and Adams reported to his wife in letters that when they entered the house, Jefferson bent down and kissed the ground. Like John Adams, Abigail Adams, and generations of the Adams family were Shakespeare devotees. Abigail was well educated for a female, and she, those of you who have seen it, she wrote 1,100 letters that were saved to her husband when he was working to put our government together. And she signed her name Portia, who was the heroine of Merchant of Venice. Their son, John Quincy Adams, who was the 6th president, read and reread Shakespeare and went out of his way to attend plays. As an adult, he quoted lines and passages from Shakespeare in his diaries and letters and wrote that, quote, Shakespeare was the great master of nature and the great teacher of morality and politics. Adams was obsessed especially with Shakespeare's Othello and referred to that play frequently in his letters to his mother. This is what one of my talks was about, and in particular about John Quincy Adams and his attitude toward Blacks and women. Although he favored abolition, John Quincy doubted whether African men were temperamentally suited to be integrated into white society. He was especially concerned, like many Americans, with race mixing, or what they called then amalgamation of the races. It was a popular concern at the time. You would see cartoons about that. So even as an abolitionist like he was, who didn't want to see anyone enslaved, couldn't abide the idea of integrating Blacks into American society. However, his hatred was reserved not for Othello, for the protagonist Othello, but for Desdemona. In 1836, in an article in American Monthly Magazine, in which he analyzed the play, and by the way, this article was reprinted many times right up to even the Civil War. Adams condemned Desdemona, and he called her unnatural passion compared to Juliet's natural passion. They were both young women, and her elopement and secret marriage to Othello, and this is his quote, indicate a personal character not only very deficient in delicacy, but totally regardless of filial duty, of female modesty, and of ingenuous shame. And when Othello smothers her in bed, this was so stunning. He wrote, the terror and pity subside immediately into the sentiment that Desdemona deserved it. So then I went on in another place to discuss what his experiences had been with women, even though he had his mother was so outstanding a person. So Lincoln, as I mentioned, was also a Shakespeare devotee and would recite speeches from Hamlet and Macbeth. But when he was an itinerant lawyer, he kept a copy of Macbeth in his pocket and quoted from it often. His favorite plays he reported were, and this was a quote, Lear, Richard II, Hamlet, Macbeth, but I think nothing equals Macbeth. He wrote, referring to the political machinations, the portrayal of raw ambition, the role of his wife, and all of those elements were very meaningful to him. In the wake of his assassinations, mourners turned to Macbeth to express their grief. A quote from Act 1 in Macbeth says, his virtues shall plead trump-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. It appeared everywhere in broadsides and was put on wherever the Lincoln's train went. Even John Wilkes Booth, his murderer, quoted Macbeth in his last diary entry. And this is Booth saying, I must fight the course, he quoted, 'tis all that's left of me. So this was all before the Civil War. The Civil War, of course, there was fewer, but even after the Civil War, the influence of the theater lessened, and because for one thing, America began developing its own stable of playwrights, but technology changed everything. So the theater was no longer the only game in town. You had newspapers, cartoons, there were literary journals, and they relied on Shakespeare as well to make sense of the struggle and the chaos. The new media, photography and chromolithography used in broadsides and posters made images of Shakespeare's actors all over the place. But Shakespeare, the theater, had to share the stage with these other kind of technologies. Most important, I guess, was the emergence of the press. The Hearst and Pulitzer empires were powerful. They had a readership of over 20 million people a day. People didn't have to rush to plays to get their social media fix, to sort of or to get an understanding of the world that they were living in. But by then, also, immigration had a tremendous destabilizing effect, starting in 1870, but particularly 1880s and 90s through 1920. To many American-born, the numbers of these new immigrants in their strange ways threatened the country's stability. And in fact, there was reason for them to be worried, because the transformation in that period was quite astonishing, much like the transformation in that antebellum period. Between 1880 and 1914, more than 20 million immigrants entered the United States. But the population of the United States was only 50 million. So here was coming on almost half, 40% of everybody. We're new people with new ideas, new backgrounds, looking for ways to survive. The newcomers, which included 4 million Catholics from southern Italy and Eastern Europe, and 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe, surpassed immigrants from Northern European lands like England, Germany, Scandinavian countries. In 1910, an amazing 3/4 of New York City's population consisted of new immigrants and their first-generation children. Can you imagine? Those are many of your parents and grandparents. 3/4, 1/4 were only the people who had lived there before. So assimilating these newcomers was no easy matter for the country and for the immigrants as well. It's kind of interesting that Italians came to build the railroads on the East Coast and for other jobs, and they were those migrant groups were largely male. They thought they'd come here, they'd make money and go back and buy a plot of land. But Jewish immigrants were not going back. They had no back to go to. So they came as families with children in tow. And they had nothing. I remember one day I was at the airport. It was a JetBlue flight. It was coming in from Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. And I thought, oh my God, these people come in and they can call their parents and say, I arrived. They can get on FaceTime with their parents. But when when these Jewish immigrants came, they said goodbye. That was it. They didn't know if they'd see those parents again. They didn't know if they'd hear their voices again. So they were really cast adrift from everything they knew, and they only had each other to rely on. And their peers were struggling with the same anxieties and problems that they had. And all they had to sort of help them out were their newspapers and their theaters. So now newspapers were a new social media. They were a phenomenon. And the Yiddish papers played a vital role in educating and assimilating these immigrants. There were 15 daily general circulation English newspapers in New York that catered to immigrants and their diverse languages. That the comic strips, I never thought about this, but the Cats and Jamakids, I think, were the first comic strip. They didn't have any text. They didn't have any bubbles with words. It was strictly action. And that was one of the things that the Pulitzer chain did, and also the Hearst chain would do, to get immigrants to buy their papers. The little later, the fledgling movie industry was perfect for them because there was no language. It was very physical medium. And so that they were able to turn to that. The Jewish immigrant community published 7 daily papers of their own. 7. I only know the Forvitz and the Tug, the Day, but there were 7, at one time. The earliest and the most popular of these was the Forward, which was begun in 1870, and by Abraham Kahn, who for 40 years was the editor. He saw this paper, socialist background, as an Americanizing agent. It was there for education, and the Bentel Brief in particular was there to help people with all the myriad problems that these new immigrants confronted. The Forward had a circulation of 500,000 in 1915, but that really underestimated it because people would sit and read the Forward, the Forvitz, to cigar makers as they were working, to people who were, tailors, and they would pass it around, and they would be read aloud in families. So it was very influential. But getting back to the Yiddish Theater, I'm going to get there. By the 1880s, the Yiddish Theater joined the Yiddish newspaper as an influential tutor for these immigrants. It was the theater, not the synagogue, no little storefront shulas, and the lodge, which served as the community's major gathering place. And in New York City, the Bowery and 2nd Avenue was its epicenter. So let me tell you just a very little bit about the Yiddish Theater, which I'm sure you probably are familiar with. So it started in Romania by Goldfaden, and it was sort of an extension. And it's funny that we don't do it much. These Purim spiels, little plays. I remember John Franklin and Sam. John Franklin would write a play. I remember Sam and Bert, putting on costumes and acting it out, doing something for Purim. But that was a fun thing to do. I don't know if you still do that. I don't remember that we did it too often in CHJs. But the Purim Spiel kind of was the opening wedge for a theater. But the Yiddish Theater was in Yiddish. And for the Haskilim, the educated, the new generation that was rejecting everything about the shtetl, it was a shande. It was just terrible. They wanted people to go to the theater in Polish or in German or in Lithuanian and not in Yiddish. But the Yiddish Theater became popular right away. But it moved as the Jews were moving from the shtetls to Warsaw, to Vilnius, then west to even Paris and to London, and then to the United States. Between 1890 and 1940, I don't know why they used 1940, there were over 200 Yiddish theaters and touring Yiddish troops in the United States. Not all at the same time, but coming and going. When the United States entered World War I, there were 22 Yiddish theaters and 2 Yiddish vaudeville houses in New York City alone, offering some series, a lot of light, or what did my uncles used to go to occasionally? I forget. They would go downtown too, still to see some of this, but it was, melodramas, it was minstrel shows. And in addition to that, there was some theater. In 1902, there was this writer in the Globe, Hutchins Hapgood, and he said that the Yiddish Theater was I have this plugged in, and it's showing that I might have to move because I don't want to lose you guys. Let's see, I'll go a little further and see how much more I can go. So he was writing, well, who goes to the Yiddish Theater? And he wrote, this is a quote, the sweatshop woman with her baby, the day laborer, the Hester Street shopkeeper, the anarchist, the socialist, the ghetto rabbi and scholar, the poet, the journalist. He said they were all there. The poor and ignorant are in the great majority, he said, but the learned, the intellectual, and the progressive were also present. And sometimes there were 20, 30 performances a night. They were Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday and Wednesday were added. Tickets ranged from 10 cents to $1, depending on where you sat in the house. The earlier Jewish immigrants from Germany who had come following the German Revolution in the late 1840s and 50s, who felt that they were assimilated, looked at with horror at this early Yiddish theater. It was chaotic, it was dirty, it was filthy, it was everything that they didn't want. In fact, there was a play that I read about that they bribed the actress not to go on to say she was sick so that they could stop this terrible performance. But Tomaszewski, Boris Tomaszewski, big beard, big guy, stepped into this female role. So early on, the Yiddish theater's offerings were bawdy and melodramatic. A chaos reigned. People would throw things at the actors. They would interrupt. The actors would interrupt. They would quarrel with one another. It was just chaos. And Jacob Adler, who was involved with Yiddish theater in its early beginnings in Romania and then in Poland, and knew Jacob Gordon, who was a friend of his and in socialist circles. Gordon was a writer, but he was part of that new cadre of realist writers who didn't write this fanciful stuff, but like the Yiddish theater, dealt with real people with real problems. And he asked him to write a serious play. Gordon was similarly disturbed by the lack of decorum he found in the Bowery theaters, the unlikely plots, the impossible jumble of comedy, tragedy, melodrama, rude jokes, dance routines, music hall numbers thrown in at random, actors who grabbed center stage and basked in the crowd's affection, and raucous, rowdy audiences that ate and drank throughout his performances. As he later explained, he wanted to, and this is a quote, utilize the theater for higher purposes, to derive from it not only amusement, but education. And he took on the job of writing for Adler. And over the next 20 years, he wrote more than 100 serious plays. In his quest for the perfect vehicle, Gordon, finally we're getting there, turned to Shakespeare and adapted for his first play, and for the first few, what I would call the domestic plays, the plays that dealt in some way with family. King Lear, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and Othello. These became the most popular in the Yiddish theater repertoire. And Gordon was convinced that Shakespeare, so beloved by American audiences, would provide his theater goers with what they craved. Entertainment that would enable them to laugh and cry with characters whose problems mirrored their own. Disobedient, ungrateful children, families torn apart, betrayals, clashes between old country values and American temptations. They were all there. In 1892, for his first foray into serious theater, Gordon chose King Lear. It had all the requisite elements: an authoritarian father, mercenary children, multiple family disputes, and disaster. And he struck gold with his Yiddish adaptation, which changed the direction of Yiddish theater. He didn't use a direct translation of Lear. Rather, he just wove a meaningful story around Shakespeare's themes. As one historian put it, Gordon's Lear offered a little bit about Shakespeare, but a lot about what it meant to be Jewish. As you may recall on the original King Lear, and let me just mention here too that Shakespeare has been adapted through the centuries. They're a good thing that they created these Shakespeare folios because it was always in flux. Every generation, different countries have transformed Shakespeare to their own purposes. So this is the original. And the original, if you remember, King Lear tells his three daughters that he's giving up his throne and dividing his kingdom. And the two daughters, Goneril and Regan, fawn all over him. But his favorite, really, Cordelia, doesn't want any part of that. She doesn't need to fawn over her father. She feels her feelings are genuine. She's restrained. And Lear is furious, He dismisses her and transfers all his property to the two sisters. So greedy with ambition, both Goneril and Regan undermine their father's authority little by little and render him powerless and impoverished. Unable to believe that his daughters have betrayed him, Lear goes mad, flees the castle, unwinds, is blind by now, blindly on the moor, accompanied by his fool and by Kent, a loyal nobleman who was stuck with him. In the meantime, the daughter he banished, Cordelia, marries the King of France, amasses an army, and returns to save her father from invading foes, but she loses. Edmund, who's Kent's son, was the victor. It tries to save her, but he's killed by his own brother. Meanwhile, Goneril, jealous of Regan, poisons her sister, kills herself, and Lear's heartbreak, and he dies, but after he carries Cordelia's dead body off in his arms. How Gordon saw that he was going to be able to transform this, I don't know, but he did. So Gordon did keep the basic themes of greed and family dysfunction with an adaptation that made more sense to the Jewish community. So in place of the king, Gordon created a wealthy merchant, David Moishala, who at the traditional family Purim celebration, wearing a costume of King Ahasuerus and surrounded by his court in costumes, announces that he and his wife, Chanaleah, are moving to Palestine to live out their days. And he's going to give his business to his daughters. The wife objects. She says, and this is the first she's heard of it. He doesn't even have the respect to tell her in advance. And she says, these girls aren't responsible. You can't do that to us, but do what he did. So the daughters, there are three daughters. Two are married. One, Etzela, is married to a man who is a chassid. Gordon finds him a bit of a fool, superstitious, not thinking. And the other, Gittela, is married to this guy who was a Jewish Orthodox, but corrupt. The youngest one, Tabala, is not married. Like Cordelia, she's her father's favorite. She's secular Jew and enlightened, and she wants her father's love, but she rejects the gifts that he offers her. And Moishala, like Lear, rebukes Tabala for refusing to pay him attention and sends her away. Tabala's friend, who's her teacher, Herr Yaffe, they call him the Deutsche. The Deutsche not only means he was German, not necessarily, but that was the term for people who were Jewish people then, who were educated and trying, with the Enlightenment and trying to get progressive new ideas. So the Herr Yaffe, the Deutsche, is sort of like a clear-sighted Kent, and is there at the party and warns Moishala of the fate of King Lear, that King Lear suffered with his own daughters. And he says, you're going to be sorry for this. And he and Tabala depart off to study medicine in St. Petersburg. So ignoring Yafi's advice, Moshe entrusts his son-in-law, Avram, with his fortune, which he wants divided equally among his daughters. Not surprisingly, once the old couple is gone, Avram reneges on the agreement and schemes with his own brother to shelter the fortune just for his wife and himself, much to his later undoing. His incompetence and the other son-in-law's laziness bring Moshe's empire down eventually. So without the stipend from his business, Marshall is off there in Palestine. He has to come back. He's reduced to poverty and he's blinded by illness and not welcome in his daughter's homes. So he's forced with his friend to go begging in the streets, like Lear went on the moors. The daughters soon have their comeuppance when Avram's own brother, with whom he had conspired to steal the fortune, steals it from him, leaving not only Moshe, but the daughters and their husband penniless. Now, how is this going to end? Is there going to be a Jewish story where everybody gets killed in the end? Never. Gordon's King Lear stresses forgiveness and reconciliation. The virtuous Tabla, by then a doctor, finds her way to cure her father's blindness, and at her wedding to Yaffa encourages the family to reunite. Moshe forgives his daughters and their husbands and figures out how to restore the family's function. So everything, what was it? And then they all go to the beach at the end. What was that? Remember that movie, Never on Sunday, after all those tragedies. And then they go to the beach. The play's hopeful ending, in which love and unity are restored, serves a very different purpose for its intended audience than the original King Lear. In Gordon's hands, the audience goes home renewed and satisfied. Their own problems seem less dire. They're confident that their family tensions will also be resolved. Gordon's King Lear, Yiddish King Lear. By the way, on the broadsides advertising this, he didn't give this play a name like Moshe something or other. No, he called it the Yiddish King Lear. So I should do it this way because of the Yiddish. So he spells out with a Kaf, Nun, a Gimel, King Lear. It was so successful in the next few years, he adapted Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, even bringing it to Broadway. Hamlet was the yeshiva bacha. It was called the Wilde Mensch, the wild man. It was about this young man who returns from the yeshiva, moody, introspective. His uncle has taken over. There's family conflict. He's torn between justice and morality and what he should do, and delivers that famous soliloquy, Sein to sein or nicht zu sein. He also did Othello and Macbeth with great success. He also, Shakespeare, once he got this going, he did Goethe's Faust and adapted some Ibsen plays as well. But Gordon's greatest hit was another takeoff from King Lear. In 1898, Gordon, who supported women's rights and suffrage, created Mirala Ephros, a play about a successful woman entrepreneur. Known as the female King Lear, Mirala was not only Gordon's most popular play, but one considered by critics to be one of the greatest hits of the Yiddish stage. In fact, in 1937, a Yiddish performance of the play in New York sold an incredible 1,750,000 tickets, 1937, at the height of the Depression. As in the Yiddish version of King Lear, Mirala's children underhandedly take control of her business and reduce her to poverty. Her pride prevents her from coming to their aid when they suffer losses, but she is persuaded to reconcile with her children when she shows up uninvited to her grandson's bar mitzvah, and he asks her to get back with his family. As trite and melodramatic as these plays seem to us, they were balm for the thousands of theatergoers who packed the serious Yiddish theaters. Seeing themselves and their problems in plays that were considered realistic at the time helped members of the audience to resolve the contradictions between the pressing demands of the new world and their enduring attachment to families and traditions of the old. And their love for Shakespeare made them feel like Yankees. But Shakespeare at this period also had a dark side, and that was in The Tempest. Uptown at the elite Astor Theater, where New York's 400 decorously watched Shakespeare's offerings, it was The Tempest, and in particular, the character Caliban, who they identified with the wretched refuse downtown on 2nd Avenue. I mentioned Hutchins Hapgood before, and he wrote this wonderful book, The Spirit of the Ghetto. He, like an anthropologist, immersed himself in that community. He frequented the cafes in the evening. He discussed the plays in the Yiddish Theater with the men in the cafes who were pressers and cigar makers. And he said that these men could have been Talmudic scholars or rabbis and were just brilliant, and that he thought this community had a spiritual heart. But his views were unique. Contempt for the huddled masses among the elite of New York, and especially among the progressive educators and newly minted social scientists was endemic. You know, in that period, anthropology starts, sociology starts, the study of human beings, and the influence of Darwin really becomes very important in this period. And these scientists who begin defining race as a characteristic of people that had never been done before, they take a dim view of these immigrants, Jewish immigrants down in the East Side. And what they were afraid of mostly was similar to what Adams was afraid of when he talked about amalgamation, is that they would, and you hear this trope in Trump and these anti-immigrationists, that these immigrants were going to amalgamate with white Anglo-Saxon Americans and lead to race suicide. And Caliban was their poster child. Turning to Shakespeare, they found in the character of Caliban, he was the son of the witch Sycorax, who had been banished from northern Africa, and the devil. And Caliban was the embodiment of their worst fears, this half man, half beast. In Shakespeare's words, he was, quote, a devil, a born devil on whose nature nurture can never stick. And that was the phrase that they stuck to, that nurture can never stick, that there's no way that these immigrants can be assimilated, never. So Caliban became the poster child for the immigrant masses that threatened their country. And here I just picked a couple of examples. In his book, Caliban, The Missing Link, anthropologist Daniel Wilson claimed that Eastern European immigrants, Jews and Italians, were less than human and not far removed from Caliban, the half-human link between the brute and the man. You know, they were also obsessed with this missing link thing between the animal world and the human world, and Blacks, Indians were seen as very close to this missing link. In 1914, Edward Allsworth Ross, one of the founders of the field of sociology, and an ardent eugenicist, similarly made an explicit connection between Shakespeare's Caliban and immigrants in his book, The Old World in the New. Ross conducted scientific field work in New York City's Union Station, where he observed garment workers trudging home after 10 to 12-hour days in nearby sweatshops. Of 368 he counted, only 38 looked American. And he wrote this: to one accustomed to the aspect of the normal American population, the Caliban type shows up with a frequency that is startling. In every face, he said, there was something wrong. Lips too thick, mouth coarse, upper lip too long, cheekbones too high, chin poorly formed, the bridge of the nose hollowed, unquote. Even when these immigrants appeared in their Sunday best, he said, one, quote, is struck by the fact that from 10 to 20% are hirsute, low-browed, big-faced persons of obviously low mentality. That's our grandparents. The following year, the LA Times published a piece by John Madison Taylor, a prominent pediatric neurologist, in which he argued that 1/5 of the inhabitants of the nation are unfit for the ordinary performance of civic duties. In his article, Race Peril at Our Door, God, you just hear this trope being repeated. Taylor linked that 1/5 to recent immigrants. And this is a quote. Already our almshouses, jails, homes for feeble-minded, deformed, blind, and chronically diseased are filled with the foreign-born and their second generation. Mixing old and new American stock, he said, risks producing offspring that become alternately one fairly sound, Mendelian law, the other a monster, a Caliban. There's more. Another contemporary scientist, Henry Herbert Goddard, a prominent psychologist and segregationist, famous for his widely publicized study of immigrants arriving in Ellis Island in steerage in the 1910s, found that 83% of the Jewish immigrants, 80% of Hungarians, 79% of Italians, and 80% of Russians were feeble-minded. Goddard supported the immigration restriction and sterilization movements, although he favored establishing colonies where such misfits could be segregated. Our old friend, Henry Cabot Lodge of Connecticut, who had what he called, quote, a blind devotion to Shakespeare, and who also, like others, had carried a volume of Shakespeare's plays with him to consult, complained in an introduction to a book of essays titled Shakespeare in America that Caliban, the recent immigrant, was unlike the humanity we know. And Shakespeare almost alone anticipated the problems of American settlement in a detached light. What he was referring to was the fact that the American indigenous people had been taken to London, and Shakespeare had seen them in the street. They were widely paraded around, and he was hinting here that Shakespeare saw them and wondered what's going to happen with society now that this half man, half beast would be introduced. After teaching history at Harvard and serving in the U.S. House of Representatives for 7 years, and then in the Senate for 31 years, Lodge warned in a speech on the Senate floor that when you begin to pour in unlimited people of alien or lower races of less social efficiency and less morale, you are running the most frightful risk a people can run. The lowering of a great race means not only its own death, but that of civilization. In 1896, Lodge introduced the first of several immigration restriction bills. Although this effort failed, Lodge and the American Immigration Restriction League, who had funding from the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation, Harriman Railroad Fortune, lobbied for immigration restriction, sterilization, segregation, and extermination tirelessly. By 1921, the bill passed both houses, which it had before, but presidents had refused to sign it. However, Harding in 1921 did sign the bill. Congress instituted country-by-country racially driven quotas, which were made even more restrictive in 1924. So these quotas preferenced immigrants from the Northern European countries, from England, Scotland, the Scandinavian countries, even Germany, but kept out undesirable ethnic groups from Southern and Eastern European countries and from Asia. Like Lodge said, they were unlike the humanity we know. Under the bill, more than 50,000 German immigrants could be admitted annually. But Lithuanian immigrants, primarily Jewish, dropped from the thousands where they had been coming to only 340. The effect on Jewish immigration was immediate. Overall, immigration from Eastern European countries fell 80%. And it continued. And despite appeals during the 30s and 40s with the rise of Nazism and Hitler, and appeals by Jews everywhere, to allow more Jews to enter the country, Jews who were doomed to death camps and gas chambers if they couldn't escape. The law remained intact until 1965, when Johnson pushed immigration reform through along with civil rights reform. It would take the Holocaust to show the world the logical endpoint of such horrific ideology, discrediting much race-based science and forcing eugenics hardliners into the shadows, but as we sadly learned, not out of the picture. I talk about this community having all these wonderful, really progressive groups and clubs that I belong to, that I'm active in, Concerned Citizens, the Democratic Club, but I could show you the newspaper where there's the announcements of coming speakers, and right next to whatever speakers we're having in the Democratic Club or Concerned Citizens, there's John Birch Society. And the Republicans are having one of the guys who was complicit in the January 6th and was released after serving 3 years, or how could he serve 3 years? No. Anyway, he was going to speak to them. So they were in the shadows, but they're not out of the picture. And as we know, they're gaining force. So what happened with the Yiddish Theater? With the Yiddish speakers were almost entirely wiped out in the Holocaust, and the Yiddish theaters in Europe were destroyed. Also, Jews who were able to get to Palestine with the new country's emphasis on Hebrew as a language eschewed Yiddish and the Yiddish theater, so that it had no opportunity to establish a foothold there. There remain some Yiddish theaters throughout the world, but they perform very seldom, and very sporadically. There is the Volksbein People's Theater in New York City, which was founded 107 years ago, and it's still going, but I don't know how many performances they have a year. And there's also a Dora Wasserman Yiddish Theater in Montreal, which has been active since the 1950s. But Gordon also still surfaces. In May 2018, there was a performance of the Yiddish King Lear in New York at the Metropolitan Playhouse. And in 2023, the Shakespeare Theater Club in Washington, D.C. performed an exact translation of Gordon's Yiddish King Lear. But the Yiddish theater kept its influence in other ways. I found a list of American actors. I thought it was fun, who had their beginnings in the Yiddish theater. They may not surprise you, but it will remind you who they were. So there was Paul Muni, Walter Matthau, Herschel Bernardi, Edward G. Robinson, Menashe Skolnick, Joel Gray, Jerome Robbins, James Garfield, Molly Pekin, Eddie Cantor, Sophie Tucker, Zero Mostel, Stella Adler. The Gershwins were born there. Irving Berlin was born in that neighborhood, in Strasbourg. So their influence will continue. Tomaszewski, who was a favorite of Adler's and was featured in a lot of Gordon's plays, and his wife, who started her own theater company also, was like the leading actor in the Yiddish theater. His son, well, you would know this less because you're not West Coast, Michael Tilson Thomas, who was the conductor of the San Francisco Symphony for 25 years. And he's trying to do his best to keep the Yiddish theater and his grandfather's role alive. By the way, Tomaszewski was found because he had this wonderful voice, and he came from a family of cantors. And most of Gordon's plays, because he had to do this, had a little song and dance interval somewhere, so that he was able to use the Purim party and give Tomaszewski a song. So Caliban and our fascination with him have survived. Beginning in 1970s, The Tempest experienced an upswell of interest. It was never a popular play and still isn't. But critics of European and American colonialism, I hate to say it, but the woke crowd, began to see the play as a reflection of the relationship between colonizers and vanquished people. In this view, Caliban is not the despised half-human, half-beast of a century and a half ago who has to be overcome. He's an aboriginal living in harmony with the land and his environment when an exploitive colonizer, Prospero, enslaves him. Caliban's brutishness and inability to learn the Duke's civilizing language and adopt his culture is not due to his subhumanity and lack of intelligence, but his refusal to acquiesce. Perhaps because of the cleverly ambiguous image, Caliban has served as a Rorschach test, both reflecting the values of continuing generations and rationalizing their cultural beliefs and practices. His character and the play will no doubt continue to evolve and be adapted, as will King Lear and Shakespeare's other popular plays. With their universal themes and complex and enduring characters, these plays will continue to be reinterpreted, and reimagined. And Shakespeare, already imparting 4 centuries of wisdom, will remain a cultural icon for generations to come, serving Americans and others as a touchstone for their lives and a guide to understanding their world. That's it. So those of you who have disappeared can come back.
Wow. Kudos.
Yeah, it was. I mean, there's still so much for me to learn about the Yiddish theater, but again, this wasn't about this Yiddish theater. It was about the influence of Shakespeare and how the Yiddish theater was able to use Shakespeare to their own benefit. So if any of you are interested, there are a couple of books out there, but maybe this will encourage you to support Yiddish theater in some way when you see it come up.
Yes. Thank you.
Oh, good, Manny. Thank you. A question.
Yeah, thanks for a very interesting talk. Have you looked at Yiddish film as well as theater?
No, not I, but that would be a later.
There have been many Yiddish films produced in this country and in Europe.
I bet that would be a terrific dissertation for some PhD student or master students, to look at them. I was always very interested in popular culture and how it reflects the society. I remember years ago when I was in graduate school reading an article that somebody had done analyzing the lyrics of songs from the 1950s. It's fascinating. And at one time I had my students look at the sitcoms of the 60s and 70s. And, when you watch a whole bunch in a row, you discover things that are really fascinating. And when you're immersed in it, you don't see it. That's part of your world. Remember McLuhan, the goldfish doesn't know that it's swimming in water, we're not aware of our own culture.
Right. By the way, while I have a chance, you listed Joel Grey as somebody who came from the Yiddish theater. It's his father that did, Mickey Katz. Joel Grey recently got involved in Yiddish theater. He doesn't have any real Yiddish background.
Oh, that's neat. His father
recently was involved in putting on a Yiddish version of Fiddler on the Roof.
So
that's his connection. But he didn't come from the Yiddish theater. His father did.
Oh, okay. So that was on the list that but
at
Manny,
least as far as I know.
What's your interest in this?
Oh, I know a lot of the people in the current Yiddish theater. Joel Grey's production was with the Volksbühne, which you mentioned, and people involved with the Volksbühne, a number of them I went to summer camp with them.
Oh, gee.
I went to Camp Hemshech, which was Yiddish socialist camp, mostly of children of Bundes and mostly children of Holocaust concentration camp survivors, and very very Yiddish, somewhere to the left of the Felvets.
Well, that would be an interesting study, wouldn't it? You know, Jewish summer camps. Wow.
Mm.
And a lot of them are still involved in Yiddish stuff. They're trying to keep Yiddish going, and with a lot of dedication.
And so I mean, here it's 6 o'clock, but there it's 9 o'clock. I didn't notice exactly what time we started, but you've been very patient.
It's interesting.
It's
I
good.
learned a lot.
Yeah, well, it was a lot of fun for me to, as I say, go down that rabbit hole, you know, with several of them.
I think that's an interesting idea, studying Jewish camps.
Yeah.
Really
Mhm.
different kinds, and it's really interesting.
Well, and I bet they were early on an Americanizing kind of force. And I'm sure they came from, I bet there were summer camps, Yiddish summer camps. I know there was Yiddish summer camps in Europe way before the war.
Well, in New York City, people had to get out of the city in the summer. You know, among other things, there was a lot of polio, and you could get very sick. It was better to send the kids away than to take them to the beach.
Yeah, well, before air conditioning, that was the thing to do. You know,
Yeah.
you send the whole family up to the Catskills. And there have been studies of the Catskills. So
Actually, Catskills. I didn't go to camp in the Catskills. I went to camp in Massachusetts, but or in New Milford, actually. But it was there were very many different kinds. It was kind of interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
I didn't go to camp any place, but I did go to the mountains, the Catskills. And that's where I learned a lot of Yiddish because we were children and we snuck into the shows at the hotels and we learned a lot of kind of risque Yiddish.
Mm-hmm.
And it was fun. But I wanted to say something about your talk, which ranged so widely. I mean, there were talks within the talks. I learned so much about race and immigration through history that was almost could be separated as another talk. It was very informative in a lot of different ways.
Well, that's why it's so hard for me to put this together because this was several lectures, but I thought that these trends did fit and
They did.
that they would give you a better understanding of Yiddish theater.
You made them fit. Yeah.
They're wonderful. You did a great job. I was very, very
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank you.
I also loved the only Yiddish production I ever saw was the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof, which I loved.
I mean, you don't have to know Yiddish to enjoy that.
You didn't, and the actors were not Yiddish speakers, but they learned.
Wow.
And I got it. You know, of course they had subtitles or whatever you call it, you know, in Russian and English.
Oh, and English.
Yeah.
On YouTube, you can find a version of zu sein or nicht zu sein, and zu leben or nicht zu leben. I mean, there are a lot of things like that that are really enjoyable. So this has been a treat for me to see you all well. And
It's great to see you,
Come
Gloria.
again.
It's been a treat for us, Gloria.
Really
Thank
great.
Gloria, is there any chance we could get you to join us more often? Because it's afternoon for you, and we meet Fridays at 7 p.m. for half an hour.
oh my God, I have, believe me, I have thought of it many times, but I am stretched so thin here. I remember thinking one time when I was in Westport, you know, if I had one thing a week, now I have, the days are 3 major things a day.
That's great.
That's
So-
called retirement. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
It's a great community.
Yeah.
And Gloria, if you get a chance, please look up and see if you can find my friend.
I did, there wasn't any reference to her. I don't know, I'll ask around, but I didn't see anything on that.
Okay, thank you for
Yeah.
trying. I assume she's gone. Too bad. It's a
really?
lovely community.
Really, are you there in Florida permanently, or are you there just for the winter?
No, we're here while it's cold up there. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're down here, beautiful weather.
Yeah, my granddaughter, I'll probably be too busy. I was gonna say my granddaughter is getting married next October, so I know I'll be there then. And and I'll be in that old neighborhood, so
Oh, well, let us know.
maybe the timing will be good. That
It just in Westport, Gloria, you'll be in Westport or in Naples? Which neighborhood are you talking about?
Oh no, I said my daughter. I guess before you came on that, my daughter moved to my old neighborhood in Westport.
Okay, so you're going to be in Westport in October. I'll be there.
Oh, that'd be great.
I'll let you.
But you can join us from Laguna. Also,
I can.
You did today.
He's
Oh,
busy, yeah.
and I'll
You
think of
know,
it.
check our website. It's humanisticjews.org. And if you see
Yeah.
anything that catches your fancy, you can send somebody an email and we'll send you a link to a meeting that's on Zoom.
Good idea.
Yeah.
I remember Saul, that Saul came up with that, right, Barbara?
Yes,
Is
Yep.
that a
I'm
hand I
looking
see
forward to the
there?
wedding.
Previn wants to say something.
Thank you very much, Gloria, for your presentation, taking all this time from sunny California to address us over here in freezing Connecticut. And thank you, Marilyn, for arranging this. And thank you, Rona, Sheila, and Barbara for relieving me of this very difficult task for this week. I'm very happy that I have all of you to prop me up and make me stand and all that stuff. So thank you. Appreciate it.
And I have a plug in my oil tank.
Hey,
And the guy is coming tomorrow to tell me about a temporary tank. Apparently they can't I've got to get rid of the oil.